Hello and welcome to another video. So if we have to understand what is going on the front line, we have to look at the tactics and strategies used by each side and why they are using it. So first off, we have to take a look at the most volatile part of the front line, the part south of Velika Novosilka. The rest of the front lines, there isn't a lot of movement as there has been a conclusive result to the fighting there. However, by Velika Novosilka, it's much more dynamic, which allows for a better analysis of the fighting ongoing as it is continuously ongoing. So the question here, what exactly is the tactics being used by each side? So the Russian tactic is, I've already covered it in a live stream. It is available for Patreons, my whole archive of live streams. But essentially, in a nutshell, the Russian tactic is that they do not advance and fight the Ukrainian forces. They instead withdraw and launch artillery strikes on them. The way they do that is that their frontline personnel are highly mobile forces. They are forces that can quickly withdraw and start up new defensive positions. And then this allows them to, in this scenario, withdraw from Neskushne, go to Storoshevo, withdraw from Storoshevo, go to Makarivka, withdraw from Makarivka and go to Staromayske. And every time they hold a new place before they withdraw further. So essentially what the Ukrainians are doing is that they are attacking Neskushne. They fight the Russian forces while they're getting hit by artillery as well as Russian airstrikes and air support. So they are under heavy fire and the Russians are trying to hold them back. But once the Ukrainians launch enough forces and they are able to overcome the Russian defenses, the Russians then withdraw to the next line and then the Ukrainians advance further and then the situation repeats itself. Every time the retreating Russian forces try to slow down the advancing Ukrainians, who are usually numerically superior because the Russians only send their highly mobile forces to the front line, and that advantage allows the Ukrainians to just outman and outfire the Russian forces. The Russians heavily rely on their artillery to be able to match up with the numerical superiority of the Ukrainian forces. However, because the Ukrainian forces are also highly mobile, because they mainly use their armored vehicles to launch these spearhead attacks on the Russian positions, this means that the Russians will not be able to hold for a long time because the artillery is only as effective as how long they're able to launch at the opponent. If the Ukrainians are launching their attacks with high mobility, then they don't give the Russians a lot of time to advance and attack on their positions. So the longer the Ukrainians are fighting in these parts of the front line, the better it is for the Russians because the Russians just launch artillery strikes on their positions. When the Ukrainians are fighting, then they are exposed, which allows the Russians to easily detect and launch their artillery strikes and airstrikes on the Ukrainian positions. So the goal of the Russian forces is to expose the Ukrainian forces for as long as possible, and an even better outcome would be if they bog them down. Similar to the videos we have seen of the destroyed armored columns of the Ukrainians, the Russian forces destroyed their minesweeping equipment, which prevents the Ukrainian forces from moving because they cannot advance further due to the mine equipment, removing equipment being destroyed. So they have to advance through a minefield. So their only option is to retreat. And in that scenario, they just buy a lot of time for the Russian forces to just launch artillery strikes on their positions. Which is why we see these destroyed armored columns, because they end up being bogged down. If they destroy the first and the last vehicle, then their advance is completely stopped. They can neither withdraw or advance. And they're just stuck in the middle of a minefield and they get destroyed and hammered down by Russian artillery and airstrikes. So what is the Ukrainian strategy? How are they dealing with this? What is their goal? So the Ukrainian goal is to breach through the Russian defensive line and cut off the land bridge between Russia and Crimea. For that, they will need to advance through this whole area. They need to advance through the Russian defensive lines. They have to capture the important villages and cities, and they have to essentially hold an area whether it is this far, just Melitopol and Tokmak and Berdyansk, whichever it is, they have to go from one end to the other. And to launch such an attack where they have to go from one end to another, the best is to just go in a straight line. However, the Russians anticipating this, they know the Ukrainians want to go in a straight line, so they essentially build a whole defensive line that goes through the whole area, so no matter what, the Ukrainians have to go through the Russian defenses. And then in some areas, like ahead of Melitopol, they have built multiple lines, all the way up to 5 defensive lines. So the Russians have heavily fortified this area, and the Ukrainians have to go through a straight line. So the best way to do this is to concentrate your forces and do one major spearhead. However, if they want to do that, they have to identify the weakest spot of the Russian forces, and they also have to identify how they're going to supply this spearhead. Because what is the point of launching a spearhead and reaching the Azov Sea if they end up being unable to supply these forces, which will allow the Russian forces to just grind them down and destroy them due to the lack of supplies. So they need to do 2 things. They need to reach the Azov Sea, and they also need to hold roads and defend those roads so that they can resupply their forces. So essentially, if they want to take this area right here, they would need to take all of the important villages and cities in this area. So they need to take Melitopol, Berdyansk, Tokmak, these villages here to the west, and these villages to the east, as these are all the choke points and important roads through this whole area. Then they need to actually hold the roads as well. And as this is a very long distance with a lot of Russian defensive lines, this is a very, very difficult task. So this is why it's extra important that the Ukrainians find the weakest defensive positions of the Russian forces. So far, they have attacked in 3 directions. They have attacked south of Oryhev, they have attacked west of Oryhev, and they have attacked south of Velika Novosilka. Their greatest success has been around Velika Novosilka, where they have managed to, at some point, capture Novodonetsk. Then the Russians recaptured it, and now they have captured Neskushne, Storoshevo, Blagodatne, and Makarivka. They've also managed to capture Novodarivka and push the Russians out of Levatne. So the Ukrainians are thinking, our opponents are being pushed back here, so we have to be able to advance further in this direction. So they are sending more forces and focusing in this area. However, the Russian strategy right here is, the further down they go, the better it is for us. This is because the Ukrainians are essentially going down this road. They're having an attack in this direction, both on the eastern and western side of the river. Meanwhile, the Russian positions are here in the fields to the west of this area, and this is all located on the high ground west of these villages, which means that throughout this whole process of the Ukrainians advancing and taking these villages by the river line, they are constantly being shelled and attacked by Russian artillery and anti-tank gun missiles. At the same time, Russian air defense is meeting them. Meanwhile, as soon as they reach this area deep inside the Russian territory on the eastern parts, ahead of this village here, that is a main supply route to the village of Rivnopil, meaning if the Ukrainians capture Staromayske, then essentially the Russians would have to withdraw from Rivnopil, or otherwise they would be encircled due to lack of other supply lines in this whole area. So the Russian forces are heavily bombarding these areas, and as soon as the Ukrainians reached Staromayske, they started counterattacking. So this is because they have reached a place, an area that is important for them to hold, therefore they try to hold the line. And at the same time, the Ukrainians are being attacked from the side, so they have extended the front line where the troops are exposed, and the Russian forces have a longer area in which they can attack the Ukrainian forces. So this is actually a trap of the Russian forces against the Ukrainian forces. How are the Ukrainian forces going to deal with this? They have to surpass the Russian expectations. They have to overcome this trap. They either do it by one of 2 ways, either that they divert the Russian forces, essentially pushing eastwards instead of westwards, meaning they would have to go around straight towards Staronivka and straight towards Oktyabrsk. So through these open fields towards these areas. The weakness here is that the Russian forces have air dominance, they have air superiority, which means that the Ukrainian forces going through these fields are exposed to the Russian Air Force and they're exposed to the Russian artillery strikes. So they have to take their timing very well, and that is when it rains. Why? Because then the Russians can neither, nor the Ukrainians can neither use their drones or the Air Force, so it'll be difficult to detect them and it'll be difficult to strike them. So essentially, the Ukrainians would have to have a lot of mine clearing units, they have to focus a lot of their armored vehicles, and they have to launch a major strike in this area while the weather is either very cloudy or raining. This will allow them to take the Russians by surprise and launch a major assault. The second thing is just to push through with brute force, essentially gathering a lot of troops, a lot of armored vehicles, and just pushing through. The weakness of the Russian strategy is that it is based on withdrawal, which means that if they withdraw too much or too little, then they can end up in a weak positions. If the Ukrainians take advantage of that weak position and manage to push the Russians from their withdrawal point, then they're able to essentially outrun the Russian forces, and you'll prevent them from setting up their next defensive position. So they'll essentially be able to advance until the whole next defensive line where the Russian forces are already located. So they would essentially be able to push all the way to the first defensive line of the Russian forces, completely cutting off all of the Russian forces in this whole western section of this area. However, this would be very costly because the Ukrainians would be relying on a brute force strategy. And these two strategies are the only strategies that I can come up with that would lead to a beneficial outcome for the Ukrainian forces, because otherwise they're just stuck in this trap by the Russian forces, essentially a meat grinder, where all the Ukrainian manpower and equipment will all be destroyed in exchange for useless villages that essentially has no significance to the front line. They will not allow the Ukrainians to push through the Russian defensive lines, cut off the land bridge and all of these things. They'll essentially be wasting all that they have received, all that they have prepared, all of these experienced troops, all of these well-trained troops on nothing except for frontline villages at the point of contact ahead of the first defensive line by the Russian forces. So far, the operation, according to some sources, the Ukrainians have used about 20 to 30% of the equipment that they have been sent by the West. They still have 70 to 80% in reserve, which means that they have only used about a fifth of their forces. So they still have a lot to use. And it's not that they have specifically lost a fifth of their forces, but that is all that they've committed so far. But based on the fact that they stopped fighting in Oryhiv, that means that they're most likely not willing to use more of their forces in this direction. As for Veliki Novosilka, it is a different unit, so that they have different units they have different plans and all of these things. They are operating separately. So essentially what I'm saying is that the Ukrainians still have a lot of forces to spare. However, the way that they're currently doing is not sustainable. They'll eventually end up in a Ukrainian loss. That means they have to adapt their strategies to the new information that they've received. They've figured out the Russians are willing to defend. They're defending in this and that way. So we have to come up with counter strategies based on that. So the whole operation is going to depend on both sides' ability to adapt to the situation. Currently, the Russians have adapted really well. They have a strategy that works. They are retreating, which decreases the amount of casualties they receive as long as it is orderly. And the Ukrainians are falling straight into their trap, being constantly shelled and strike, and constant airstrikes supporting the Russian forces allows them to inflict heavy casualties on the Ukrainians. And in exchange, Ukrainians are getting bogged down in these minefields and just getting completely obliterated, similar to the footage we're seeing. However, the footage we're seeing is still very biased, as it is only pro-Russian sources essentially sending these footages, as the Ukrainians are doing some sort of operational security. But that doesn't guarantee that the Ukrainians have matching footage. It just means that we don't know how well the Ukrainians are doing. All we're seeing is from one perspective. So until we get the second perspective, we will only see the Russian perspective. And from the Russian perspective, this offensive is a complete failure, at least in the initial stages of it. And that is all for this video. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.